Okay. Good to be back, and good to be back for Mishnah. We are picking up where we left off, which means we are in Masechet Ketubot, chapter 5, Mishnah 1. This is going to continue our discussion of Ketubot, as you might imagine, the actual marriage compensation contract. Remember, it's not the same thing as a marriage license. It's more of what we would in the modern world call a prenuptial agreement. But as we go through this, we're also going to begin to get into, in chapter 5, into some of the rights and duties of the two members of the married family, that is to say, the husband and wife. So we're going to not exactly digress, but we will expand our understanding of obligation within a married couple to go beyond the contractual obligation at the dissolution of the marriage to what they actually owe each other during the marriage. And that's something that will continue on in next chapter as well, chapter 6 as well. I don't know if we're going to get through chapter 5 tonight, so I don't want to promise that. Is there anyone else out there, or are we good?
I thought I saw someone.
Well, they'll knock on the window if they need it. All right, so it is our custom to go round and round, which means you would be first up, Aaron. All right. Again, everyone is welcome to say pass. If you don't want to read in public, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. I don't want to embarrass or put anyone on the spot. I know what it's like not to want to read in public.
Although the sages have said a virgin collects 200 and a widow 1 money. If he wishes to add even 100 money, he may do so. Okay, so what we're getting here in chapter 5 is we had talked about there being a minimum in the previous chapters, and now we are clarifying that there is no maximum. So in modern times, the ketubah is written in a formulaic way, and no one really actually adjusts those amounts. Obviously, we can't go down because the minimum was set, as we already discussed. But in the ancient world, people would sometimes go up, meaning to say, you might make a promise to your bride-to-be that should I die or before you, or should I divorce you, I will pay you not the 200, that is the established by the sages minimum, but I will pay you 400 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever number I want to come up with. Now, remember, this is a legally binding contract. It's not just putting a lot of zeros on a piece of page because you want to love the person so much. You are going to be on the hook, or rather your estate. your estate will be on the hook. So these were real numbers, but it was what the rabbis wanted to make sure is that people understood that you could increase the number. Now, there was some hesitancy in the discussion of the Talmud about, well, but is that fair? Because if you allow people to increase, isn't that going to embarrass the people who can't afford to put a higher number on the ketubah? So there was some consideration of maybe this wouldn't be appropriate, but the halakha comes down that yes, you are allowed to increase what you are offering as part of the ketubah beyond the minimum that is required by halakha. And indentured servitude doesn't apply to this, right?
Your wife is not your servant.
Right.
We'll enforce that later on when we talk about the obligations.
When we talked about debt, if you couldn't pay a debt, they believed in indentured servitude.
Right. So you mean if you can't pay a debt, you can be sold into servitude. Right. So this would be more of a case of all of your assets would be liquidated to pay this.
Right.
Because the woman has first claim against all of your property, above and beyond every other creditor. So if you owe 10,000 zuzim to a whole host of different people, and you also divorce your wife, then she gets first pick, right? She gets paid first, and then everyone else gets paid.
Oh, that's interesting. But if you're a widow, it would be
same thing, right? If your husband had 100 outstanding debts, your debt goes to the top of the pile when it comes to paying you, and that goes before the heirs as well. Right, so you get your ketubah, and then everyone else gets paid, and then what's ever left is divided among the heirs.
If that's still not enough, though, you can't be sold though based on a divorce, right?
I don't remember ever reading the case of that, but it would be a permanent debt against you that you would have to pay off eventually. So they can absolutely do what we would in the modern world call garnish wages. So any money that came to you would go to pay off your debts, and that would be any form of debt.
So that's why, I can't remember the name of the prophet that actually told the widow, go and get, borrow as many.
Elisha.
Yeah.
Yes, when Elisha has the widow of one of his disciples.
Yeah, because his son was going to be a slave.
Well, actually, both the kids were going to be sold off, okay. And she's like, because they want to collect on my husband's debt, and so they're going to sell the kids, and of course I'll have nothing as well. What do we do? And then yes, he said, borrow the jugs and pour the small oil you have into the jugs from your neighbors. And of course, they kept pouring and pouring and pouring, well beyond the capacity of the original jug. Sold the oil and were able to pay off the debt and live off the proceeds. So yes, that's one of the great Elisha stories. Okay, part 2.
If she was widowed or divorced either after betrothal or after marriage, she is entitled to collect the entire amount.
All right, so this is an unusual anonymous form within the Mishnah that is going to be rebutted. Now, normally when there's an anonymous statement in the Mishnah, that represents the majority opinion. But in this particular case, the person who debates against it is going to win. I just wanted to give you that heads up because it's a little bit of an unusual situation. Normally when we have an anonymous statement followed by a name statement, usually the name statement loses. In this case, it's reversed. So let's make sure we understand what they're talking about. In part 2, the anonymous voice is saying that if she has already been married, or if she hasn't been married but has been betrothed, then she will still be able to collect the entire amount. By the entire amount, they mean both the amount that is the minimum plus the amount that was promised beyond that minimum. Right, the bonus, exactly, right? The extra, right? The signing bonus, you might say. So that's the opinion of this first one. And again, remember, the ritual in the ancient world or classical world was a little different than now. People would get betrothed, which is the ring ceremony in the modern ceremony. And then, we're going to see it, but about a year later, you would then get married for real, the Shefa Brachot, the 7 blessings. So what this is saying is if you signed the ketubah and you made the ring promise, and then you get divorced before you get to the finality of the ceremony, doesn't matter, you still have to pay both the minimum as well as the bonus. That's the anonymous opinion. Make sense? Okay. However,
Rabbi Elazar ben Azara says, a woman widowed or divorced after marriage receives the entire amount.
So he says, yeah. If you've gotten to the 7 blessings, the Shefa Brachot, you've actually been married, you've consummated the marriage, you're really husband and wife, then you get 100%, both the original and the bonus. However,
after betrothal, but before the marriage, a virgin collects 200 zuz and a widow only 1 mena, for the man wrote her the additional amount in order to marry her.
Right, so no. When he made the additional promise, that was sort of on condition that you would get married. But if you didn't finish the marriage because you never made it to the second part of the ceremony, then you don't get the bonus. You still get the minimum, right? Because divorce is divorce and widowhood is widowhood. But the bonus amount, that disappears. You don't get the bonus. And that is the halacha as it stands.
I forgot, after the betrothal, can the woman still decide not to get married?
You mean, so they've already done the
and everything.
She can't decide not to get married. There would need to be a reason for her to force the court to force him to grant her a divorce. Right? They are already technically married with all of the responsibilities, but with none of the privileges. Right? That's sort of the best way to keep it in mind. So if he decided he didn't want to marry her, he would have to give her a get. He would have to divorce her. He'd have to pay the ketubah. And likewise,
by ketubah, you mean the minimum ketubah?
Yeah, the minimum ketubah, exactly, is what the halakha says. All right, one more loophole that we're going to examine. Keep going.
Rabbi Judah says, if he wishes, he may write for a virgin a document for 200 zuz, and she writes, I have received from you 50 zuz.
I think you skipped a line. And she writes,
I have received from you a mena, or for a widow, he may write a document for a mena, and she writes, I have received from you 50 zuz.
Okay, so this is Rabbi Yehuda's clever little loophole. Because remember how I said that there is an absolute minimum that you can't go below? Well, he's like, well, what if you give her the ketubah, and let's say it's the standard virgin amount, 200, but then she writes you a receipt saying, I received 100, but she hasn't gotten anything, right? So she's basically gifting him back 100 zuz, the half the amount. And that means that when he dies or when there's a divorce, he would then owe her only an additional 100, which means that she would be getting half of what the minimum the sages said. Does everyone see? So his promise is for 200, but she immediately writes him a receipt saying you've already paid 100, and therefore his real promise, his real obligation is only 100 left. And that means his real obligation would only be half of what the sages had set as a minimum. And Rabbi Yehuda's argument is, hey, he made the real obligation. They just had a deal in place that she would forgive half of it. And so therefore it's all kosher. Rabbi Meir says, no. Go ahead and keep reading.
Rabbi Meir says, a man who gives a virgin less than 200 zuz or a widow less than a mena is engaging in licentious sex.
Okay. So bilat znut is the Hebrew term for this, and it basically means whoring around.
Oh, okay.
So let's make sure we like. I don't want to get too graphic, but let's make sure we unpack what the concern that Rabbi Meir has here, right? So the ketubah, you may remember when we very first began doing this whole section of the Mishnah, the ketubah was written in order to protect women, because women were leaving a secure position, meaning their family's home, and going to a new position that hopefully would work out, but was a little bit more uncertain. And therefore, you needed to have this protection, because if all of a sudden things didn't work out, or even after 5, 10, 15 years, things didn't work out, she might be left with zero. And therefore, the ketubah was going to be protection for her. The ketubah also meant that the husband had to consider seriously what his relationship was with this woman. Because by bringing her in as a wife, he knew he was undertaking an obligation of significant financial debt towards her. All right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that means that if you were able to haggle down the ketubah below a certain amount, you would essentially be able to get married and divorced for no cost. Now, what's wrong with that, right? Why should there be any sort of cost or penalty? Because down this way goes basically just sleeping around, but making it look legal, right? Remember, getting married is no big deal in Judaism as far as the ceremony goes and as far as the costs go. Yes, people have giant wedding parties and all of that, but really, you can get married for just about free. The ring needs to be worth more than a pruta, it needs to be worth more than a penny or so. But apart from that, you just need some kosher witnesses. Preferably, you've got a minyan, but again, 10 people are not exactly expensive because why are we paying them? And that means you could, if you had no obligation for a ketubah for divorce, get married in the morning, do all of your activities together, get divorced tomorrow, and it's all perfectly legal and kosher. Right? And there was no financial obligation to anyone because she signed off and said, you know, I don't need the ketubah, right? You've already paid me back. Let's say not only 100, let's say you paid me back all of it. Or let's say you paid me back all of it but 10, right? Well, what would happen if you said, I pay you back all but 10, so he divorces her the next day, and he gives her the 10. He basically just rented her as a wife. And we generally call that prostitution. Right? That this would become a system that would allow for either the exploitation of women or just straight up prostitution within the framework of Jewish law. And that's a bad thing. Right? We don't want a Jewish marriage to become a vehicle that allows either exploitation or prostitution. And so Rabbi Meir says, if there is not a significant financial commitment, then there isn't an actual marriage going on here. This is just sex. And you can dress it up however you like, but there needs to be an obligation that has some weight to it in order for this to be a real relationship. And therefore, you don't get to talk it down. You don't get to go below the minimums, even if it's this loophole-ish kind of way. And Rebbe Meir wins here. The Jewish law says that these are the minimums for the ketubah, and therefore you don't get to just use Jewish law as your own little private vehicle for sleeping around. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. What is the minimum?
The minimum is 200 if the woman is a virgin, hasn't been married before, and it's 100, which is, both of them are roughly enough to keep somebody not comfortable, but just enough for their livelihood. So it keeps them from being, homeless. Yeah.
200 what?
In the old world, the currency was called a zuz.
And what would be trans?
We don't have a good translation in the modern world, because in the modern world, purchasing power and earning potential is so different, which is why in the modern world we don't actually use those coins. We just make sure that the divorce settlements are handled fairly, according to the modern courts.
And what would be a ketubah in modern times?
In the modern times, we still use the official terms, but husband and wife both agree that as long as the civil divorce settlement is fair, that the money that's mentioned in the ketubah is not necessary. So the zuz, we don't actually...
So there's not a minimum for a ketubah?
Well, the minimum is still these numbers.
Yeah, but in modern times.
There's not a minimum number of dollars. There's not a minimum number of dollars. There's not a minimum number of ounces of gold or silver. We use the original numbers that have been used for 2,000 years. And when it comes time to actually settle up, that's where we make sure that it's fair.
In other words, they trust the civil courts.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a good
It
idea.
doesn't have a.
Well, it's actually worked pretty well. And I will say all of the major branches of Judaism trust the civil courts for divorce settlements. This is not something that only liberal Jews do. Well, it's symbolic and it's binding, right? So it's basically like saying, if we get divorced, you're going to owe me a fair amount of money. And then what is a fair amount of money? We'll let the courts decide that specifically. But in the meantime, we're going to use a placeholder of the number 200 or 100 zuzim. And that's going to be the placeholder of what it should be a fair amount. And then the courts will work out what is actually fair.
And then both parties will complain.
Not always. I have had some families that have gotten divorced, and neither complained about the ultimate arrangement.
How common is the divorce in the Jewish world?
How what?
How common?
How common? It depends on the family. It's not. I'm trying to think of I'm trying to remember the most recent statistics.
The same problem.
Well, so it's among people who are attending synagogue and living an active Jewish life, it's lower than the national average. But that's true of most people who live some form of, in some faith-based community. That is, if you have some structure around you in community, usually it will be supportive. And that will often help people not need to get divorced. But even still, divorce happens. Even in the most strictly observant communities, of course, divorce still happens, as the Torah intended. I mean, the Torah told us that divorce was sometimes the best solution to the way the current relationship was working. So I don't know what the actual statistics are. I don't know what percentage, but it's not huge. All right, we are on Ketubot 5:2.
A virgin is given 12 months from the time her intended husband claimed her, in which to prepare herself for marriage.
Okay, so next page.
Front and back.
Yeah. So you get married. Again, this is the betrothal. The husband shows up. He extends the ring to her. He says, "Behold, you are consecrated to me," blah, 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 blah. And she accepts. And then they separate, right? And then that's the engagement. And she now has a year to get ready to being married. Now, what does it mean to get ready? Well, it's not like she spends a year taking a bath. Right? It's getting her hair done, right? It's a year of preparing herself both psychologically as well as in her skill set to become a wife, to be able to do the things that are needed of an adult woman living separately from her household, from the household she grew up in. Remember, in the classical world, really all the way up into the 20th century, there was no period between being a child or being a child and getting married where you lived on your own. The idea of being a bachelor living in an apartment somewhere, or a bachelorette living in an apartment, what? It's ridiculous, right? It wasn't just ridiculous because of tradition, it was ridiculous because of economics, right? Why should you pay for an additional rent when you're not married? What do you need your own apartment for if you're not actually starting your own family? Just to store your stuff? Well, why do you need if you don't have another apartment, you don't need another sofa, you don't need another refrigerator, you don't need another oven. We've got those at home, right? So,
And mom cooks.
well, and you do your fair share as well.
Until they're 40.
Well, depending upon the family. And indeed, in many cultures, even in the modern world, children will often stay at home until they get married. And that will sometimes provide an economic advantage, right? If you're not paying rent, you can save that money, and that gives you your down payment for a house, right?
Or help their parents.
Right, and for the parents as well. If they don't have to support the youngster when they're out on one income for another rent, it can often make a lot of sense. But that's what's happening here is the woman is preparing herself for the concept of marriage. By the way, you may also remember when we started, the man too was preparing, but now we're focusing on the woman. We already did the man's preparations, now we're doing the woman's preparation.
And usually they wait for a year.
So nowadays, no. Right, nowadays we do the betrothal ceremony and we do the finalization ceremony not only one day, like in 20 minutes. Right, start to finish. A Jewish wedding is not very long. If someone wants to add in extra singing or extra something, it can get longer. But the core ceremony of a Jewish wedding, if the rabbi is stretching it, takes 20 minutes. Right? Most people like them to stretch it a little bit because otherwise it feels like it's just over too quickly. But yeah, nowadays we do both parts back to back. And that way we don't have that weird gray period in between, which worked fine 1,000 years ago. Our system works well for us now. And again, that's the same across all the denominations of Judaism. No one waits a year anymore. Good? Mm-hmm. Okay, but that year-long wait is going to create a bit of an issue. But we're going to first talk just a little bit more about this preparation.
Just as such a period is given to the woman, so is it given to the man to prepare himself.
Right. After all, if she's waiting a year before we finish, he must be waiting a year too, because they're going to get married at the same time.
A widow is given 30 days.
Right. Well, because the widow, she's already been married.
Oh.
So between the giving of the ring and the finalization of the wedding, you only need to wait 30 days, right? Because she doesn't need to learn anything new. She's done this before. So you can do a 30-day wait period. Exactly. All right. But now here comes the question of what happens during this time period.
If the time has come and they were not married, they are entitled to receive maintenance from the man's estate. And if he is a priest, they may eat teruma. Okay. So a year comes and the man says, I haven't finished getting everything ready yet. Well, who's paying for her now? Right? Remember, marriage is not just about love and romance. It's also about the economy, the economics of who's paying to take care of this woman. Now, one of the obligations of a husband, and we're going to talk about that extensively, maybe tonight, is taking care of his wife's physical needs. And that means he should be providing her food now. I mean, that was the schedule. Between today and 365 days ago, she was getting ready, which means she was part of her own household with her brothers or her father and getting everything ready. They were taking care of her. They were feeding her. She was on their bill. And now they're supposed to be married. And everybody had expected and planned and worked around the idea that she was going to be married to him. He takes over now. Now, they're not married yet, but he's still picking up the bill. Right? So that's what's happening at this 1 year mark, is even though they haven't gotten married, he's now paying for her in order to take care of her. So just imagine if people were to get engaged, will you marry me? Yes. Oh, wonderful. When do you want to get married? Oh, I don't know. We'll pick a date later, right? A year goes by. Okay, the dates, we've had a year now to work on this. You haven't set a date. You're paying my rent now, right? You're paying my groceries now. Right? That might move the date off a little bit. Right? Engagement meant you've got a year. It didn't mean.
Did you hear that, sir?
It didn't mean sometime. An engagement meant the clock was running. And when the clock expires, you're either married or you're going to get married, but in the meantime, you're paying for her because that was the expectation of the world. Make sense? Okay. But we have this question of truma. So what's truma? Truma, you might remember, is the special gift of food that was given to the Kohanim, to the priests. And truma has to be eaten while a person is ritually pure. And that means that only priests and their families can eat it. So here's the question. Is she part of his family or not? And she's betrothed to him, she's engaged, but they haven't actually gotten married yet. So should she or shouldn't she be allowed to eat this special portion of food? And the answer that the Mishnah is giving us is yes. Yes, she does. During the
moment that they get betrothed.
Right. During the 12 years, no, she's not allowed because she isn't officially part of his household completely yet.
Okay.
But once that year is up and she should have been married by now, then now he is allowed to use the truma to help her, to support her. Because the question would be, is he allowed to even give it to her? And the answer is yes. But then we get another argument, because there's always another layer to the argument. So on the issue of truma, we have two rabbis who disagree.
Rabbi Tarfon says, and they give her all of her food in teruma. And Rabbi Akiva says 1/2 of consecrated food and 1/2 teruma.
Okay. So this is one of those interesting places of which rabbi is being stricter and for which reason.
Rabbi Akiva is stricter.
For what reason?
Because I think when they say all the food, that means that's the maximum he can give, and Rabbi Akiva is saying the maximum is only half.
Because
she can't eat teruma when she's going through her menstrual cycle.
Correct.
Because she's impure.
Exactly. So what would Rabbi Tarfon's solution be during that time?
Half.
The Rabbi Tarfon.
She would have to sell the teruma to buy other stuff.
You've been reading ahead. Excellent job. Right. So exactly right. So that's what a student should do. Right. So Rabbi Tarfon's opinion is the husband can give her whatever he wants. He can give her up to 100% truma. And if that's inconvenient for her sometimes because she is ritually impure and during her menstrual cycle she can't be ritually pure during that period, then she'll just have to sell the truma to another Kohen and then she can use that money to buy regular food and then that's fine. And Rabbi Akiva is saying, why should she be inconvenienced, right? Let her soon-to-be husband give her both truma so that, yes, she can eat truma when she's ritually pure, but he also has to provide her non-truma food, what's called chulin, in order that she has something to eat when she is going through a ritually impure period.
Who wins this argument?
Rabbi Akiva.
Okay.
Right, so it looks like they're arguing about who's being stricter about truma. Really, they're arguing about who is being stricter for providing for her in the best way, in the easiest way for her to be provided for. So it's just one of those things where trying to define who's being strict sometimes is a little bit tricky. And that's why I just wanted to draw your attention to that. Okay. What's that?
I like Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi Akiva wins most of his arguments. All right, Ketubot, chapter 5, Mishnah 3. No, she said she wanted to pass. She's passing. Yes, yeah.
I was trying,
You want to listen to my Latin?
Mishnah 3.
Yes.
A Yavam, who is a priest, does not allow his sister-in-law to eat teruma.
Okay, so now we add one more wrinkle on the truma question, which is what happens in the case of yibum. Remember, Yibum is what we call in English levirate marriage, which doesn't really help because no one knows what that English word means anyway. This is the case of a woman who is widowed before she has had any children by her husband. And she then becomes automatically engaged to her brother-in-law, right, to the brother of the deceased. And the idea is they will come together, they will have a child, and that child will be considered the child of the deceased first husband.
Carry his name.
Carry his name, exactly, and his inheritance and legacy and all of that. Okay, so that's the general situation that we're dealing with here. The question is, what happens if the guy dies and she is now levirated, she is made a, go through the process of Yibum, she is supposed to be married to this guy, so they're automatically engaged, and he's a priest. Does she get to have truma? And the answer is no, right? Oh. Even though that's an automatic engagement period, just that in and of itself is not sufficient. Instead, they're going to argue about the timeline even more.
Number 2, if she had spent 6 months waiting for her husband, 6 months waiting for the Yavam.
That's the second guy.
Second, yeah. Or even if she spent all of them waiting for her husband, less 1 day waiting for the Yavam, all of them waiting for the Yavam, less 1 day waiting for her husband, she may not eat teruma.
Okay, so this is a question of, does the time she spends between the engagement and the marriage add if it was divided between 2 different men, even if they were brothers? And the answer is no, it doesn't add up. If she spent 364 days between the engagement to her first husband and his death before their marriage, then she gets automatically engaged to her brother-in-law, that 364 days or 363 days plus 1 day to the brother is not enough, right? It has to be a full year to one or the other, not a full year combined between the 2 guys. She needs to be brought into the household through a 1-year process. And if that 1-year process is not completed with regards to one guy, then it doesn't count.
So she spends a year with the
The
with the first. She spends, let's say, 366 days with the first guy, and then he dies. She can now eat teruma.
She can continue to eat the truma because she would have already begun eating the truma with the first guy.
Okay.
Right. So yes, if she had already gone into truma land, then she can stay in truma land with the brother-in-law. And that's the same thing as if they'd gotten married. Right? If they'd gotten married after 2 weeks, let's say they rushed everything and they did the betrothal and then they did the marriage 2 weeks later. Okay, yeah, she eats truma now.
Right.
And then he dies a week later. She keeps eating truma until she marries the brother and continues to eat truma, of course, in his household as well, because 2 brothers would probably both be kohanim. It's kind of tricky for them not to be.
So the key is the second part of the marriage.
Right, exactly. That second half of the marriage makes a huge difference. Or 365 days if you don't have that, right? But that 365, this section is saying, has to be complete with regards to one guy at least, right? You can't add the time spent with the 2 guys to make 1 year. It has to be 100% one guy, or else you just start the count all over again. Make sense? Which you're maybe beginning to notice. There's a reason why, for a long time, like more than 1,000 years, we marry all at once. Because leaving this window of time in between the betrothal and the actual finalization of the marriage just opens up so many problems, so many potentials for issues. So it's just, you know what, let's get in 20 minutes and go have a party, and then we're done. So, part 3.
This was the ruling according to the first Mishnah. The court, part A, the court that followed afterwards ruled, a woman may not eat teruma until she has entered the bridal chamber.
Okay, so eventually the law was changed to say, you know what, let's take care of this 365 and all of that. If you have a problem during this engagement period, it doesn't matter. If the time goes on longer, it doesn't matter. You have to be married and full married, right? This whole clock counting thing, no. From now on,
until you've actually had your wedding night, no truma. It's just a simpler rule for taking care of it. But of course, that again puts a woman at a bit of a disadvantage, because if the husband prolongs the engagement, then she can end up having difficulty feeding herself, because he may not have the resources to feed her without truma, and if she's not allowed to eat it, then she's in a rock and a hard place.
Wouldn't he have to sell his teruma to provide for her?
Theoretically, yes, that would be the best solution, but it still is problematic, because it's much better for her to eat from her husband's actual food than it is to go through this.
Teruma's kind of a deal.
Exactly. It becomes a bit of an ordeal. So that was not the ideal, but it did make things a little bit cleaner.
When did it start the 1 year waiting period? If before was if before was done like immediately?
It wasn't. Originally, there was always a waiting period. If you go back to the time of the Mishnah or other times in the biblical times, there was always a delay while the marriage was getting prepared, and that was an important economic delay, right? You had to make the arrangement to get married. I know nowadays everybody thinks, oh, we've been dating for 3 years and we're going to get married and blah blah blah, and you've got your apartment, I've got my apartment, we'll combine our stuff. That didn't happen, right? Both the people were living at home. Both the people were living with their parents, and the man had to actually create a home or create a new addition to the parents' home, because you didn't need contractors. You just stacked rocks and made a new part to the house. That would be their place, and he had to make sure that he could provide for the celebration. He had to be able to provide for her, to provide for children, because those were going to be coming pretty soon. And so you often you'd arrange your marriage, having only known the person for a little while, and then you had to do all the work. So it wasn't like you knew you were going to get married for 5 years. You only knew you were going to get married for like maybe a month. All right, it's about time to get married. Who do we want? This person, that's check. Oh, we want this person. Great. Ring ceremony. All right, now we have to make real plans. That was the normal system in the ancient world. Nowadays, it's all sort of reversed, right? Because people have full lives, and then when they get married, they bring those lives together. Back then, people didn't have a life. They were kids, and then they had to prepare themselves to be independent. Well, independent-ish, because you had multi-generational homes usually. Okay, Ketubot 5:4. I believe we're all the way back over here.
If a man consecrated his wife's handiwork, she continues to work and to consume that which she makes.
Okay. What? So we're going to just begin, and we'll probably only get through this one tonight, but we're going to just begin this question of who owns what she makes, right? So in the ancient world,
during the time that they...
No, when they're actually married. We're at full marriage time.
Okay.
Right? So we're at full marriage time. This is, husband and wife, and, he's sitting there whittling a stick, and she's sitting there knitting something, right? Classic American frontier scene. Right? We've seen it in 1,000 movies, but that was what people did, right? Everybody in the household worked, and they each provided different labor. We're going to look at some lists of specific labors, but that was what you did. You needed to contribute to the household. Remember, marriage isn't just about hugging each other. Marriage is also about building a home together. And that means each person is putting in the sweat, is putting in their work. But who owns that work, right? Does he own her work because they're married? Or does he have a claim to her work, which is a little different between owning and being able to claim it? And so this is a question that comes into sharp contrast if we're talking about the dedication of her work. If he says the wool that she is about to make, right? She's spinning wool out of the sheep hair, right? This is going to be donated to the temple. Is he allowed to do that or not? And
yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so that's now you see why we got a question, right? It's not obvious one way or the other.
Yeah.
And what happens, however? What happens if he is paying for her maintenance, right? He's buying her food. He's paying
paying for her clothes. He's taking care of all of the normal things that are the obligation of a husband to her. Does he then have the right to claim her property in advance before she's even finished it, as sort of, tit for tat, and therefore he can even consecrate it to the temple, because that consecrating to the temple shows the most the highest level of ownership of this is mine, and I can do something that will put it beyond reach forever, right? Because once it's dedicated, it's basically gone. That's what the argument is about, and we have to see that. If in the Mishnah, that what the answer is that no, he cannot consecrate it. Well, it's not that it may seem obvious in the modern world. Right, in the modern world, in the modern world where you have 2 bank accounts and 2 checkbooks and 2 credit cards and his name on his car and her name on her car, it seems obvious, right, that he should not be able to say, the stuff that she's making at her office, I have the right to dedicate to the temple. But in the ancient world, where we're all living under one roof, and where he is the one who is literally paying for the food that she eats, literally paying for the fuel in the fire, literally paying for the clothes that she is wearing, maybe he does have the right to demand what she makes so much that he is allowed to then dedicate it, even though it doesn't exist yet, as a payment for his upkeep of her. And the argument is basically, A, you can't dedicate something that doesn't exist yet, because it doesn't exist. But also B, his upkeep of her is not exactly dependent upon her reciprocating in her work, right? Because, well, I mean, it's complicated, right? Again, I know we like to think about only love and, happiness in marriage, but who owes who what is going to be a big topic, and that's something we're going to dig into more deeply. But let's finish up Mishnah 4, and then we'll see what more we can say about it tonight.
Concerning the surplus, Rabbi Meir says it is consecrated. Rabbi Yohanan says it is unconsecrated.
Okay, so okay, well, but again, we have to understand that they're speaking, according to the Talmud, they're speaking about a very specific case, right? They're saying the husband is not paying her for her upkeep, right? So he stopped paying the food bill. And so therefore she's taking the work that she makes and she's selling it to make money to feed herself. And so that everybody sort of agrees, she's allowed to keep what she makes because he isn't paying her, right? Because there's this gap in her upkeep and she's basically providing for herself. She's a working woman now because he's not paying for the food. But, and this is where they get into the debate, what happens for the stuff that she makes that's beyond what she needs to pay for her own food, right? So yes, she's made enough so that she doesn't starve, but the surplus, the extra, the bonus,
what happened with that?
Who owns that, right? Is he allowed to consecrate that or not? And that is where the conflict, the machloket, the debate, English, where the debate is now centering of whether or not the bonus part that she makes belongs to him or not.
Couldn't they just talk and agree in something?
Absolutely. Right. Couldn't they just talk about it? Couldn't they just work it out? So remember, the law only deals with the part of the world where people stop talking. Right? That's an important principle, not just for marriage and relationship laws, but also for anything else in the law. Like, you have a trouble with your neighbor. There's the law of what you actually have as your right, what your neighbor has as his or her right, and who has to pay for what. But then there's this thing called conversation, where you can discuss what happened to the tree and who's going to rebuild the wall and all of that. And all of that is perfectly open, and you can come to any arrangement that you wish, as long as it doesn't break some other law. And that's fine, right? The court doesn't mean you have to do this. The court is saying, if you haven't done anything that you both agree to, what is the actual rights of both people involved in the situation?
So absolutely, the rabbis strongly ask that not just for married couples, but for any people, that they should always try to find a way to discuss, compromise, and work a solution that is agreeable for both people before they go to the courts. But if they go to the courts, we need answers. And in this particular case, if I remember correctly, the answer is that it is unconsecrated because he's not providing for her. Therefore, what she makes does not have to be turned over to him.
Even the surplus.
Even the surplus. Even the surplus.
And the reason for the surplus is because it hasn't been yet made, though, right?
And
once she takes possession of the surplus, then he dedicates it. It's gone.
Well, once he has the right to take possession of a surplus,
right? Which
means if they have an agreement that he's allowed to it, or she's working within his household and he's providing for her, then absolutely he has the right. Right. So let's say a woman is living in the house, the husband is providing for everything as is normal for a household, and she makes a surplus of wool. He owns it automatically, and he is absolutely allowed to dedicate it. Additionally, if he is providing for her in the household, and she makes not even a surplus of wool, but a minimum amount of wool, he also gains possession of that. Right? The husband, according to the classical law, owns the what do they call it? The product, the result of his wife's work. Right? The produce. That sounds like only for food. He owns that which she makes immediately once it has been made, because he owns all property in the household, except as we've mentioned a few times, and we'll talk about more in chapter 6, except for things that sometimes are set aside before they get married or under other special circumstances. But generally speaking, if she makes it, he owns it. Unless, as we talked about in the special case, he's not providing for her, in which case she's now having to be self-sufficient even though she's married, which we're also going to talk about what happens when this gets totally out of whack, and is there any sort of financial penalty the court can put on either member of the relationship when they each stop living up to their obligations. But that will not be tonight because we're out of time.
We should have 2-hour Mishnah class.
You know, at this time of night, I'm not sure I could. I'm not sure I could keep it straight for 2 hours, but I appreciate your enthusiasm.
We were looking forward to this, Rabbi.
Me too.